Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Recycled Content, a podcast of the Association of Plastic Recyclers, an international nonprofit and the only North American organization focused exclusively on improving recycling for plastics. I'm Kara Pochiro, and I'll be your host today. Today, we're talking about the 2024 U.S. Post-Consumer Plastic Recycling Study, which found that at least 5.1 billion pounds of post-consumer plastic generated in the U.S. were recovered for recycling in 2024. Recently released by APR, along with the U.S. Plastics Pact, and published on the 2024 U.S. Post-Consumer Plastic Recycling Data Dashboard, results are based on surveys conducted by STINA Inc., as well as the National Association for PET Container Resources, or NAPCOR. As Steve Alexander, APR's president and CEO, stated, the industry has proven it can recover more than 5 billion pounds of post-consumer plastic, but holding steady isn't the goal. Plastic recycling is poised for growth, but continues to face a variety of challenges. APR has also released 2 additional reports examining how record plastic production and imports are putting pressure on domestic PET recycling, and also what needs to happen to rebuild and protect North America's recycling system. To help us connect the dots between this newly released data and the reports, I'm joined by my colleague Megan Moore. Megan is currently a program director for PET packaging at APR and leads the APR PET Technical Committee. In that role, she leads initiatives to improve PET recyclability, develop testing protocols, and support industry-wide circularity goals. She works closely with recyclers, packaging manufacturers, brands, and technical experts across the PET value chain. So she brings a practical, on-the-ground perspective to this conversation. Welcome, Megan, and thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kara. This is one of my favorite topics to discuss.
This is your first time on the podcast. I always like being joined by my APR colleagues. And before we dive into the data and reports that I just mentioned, let's start with your work as a materials engineer focused on advancing plastic recycling with over 18 years of experience in PET packaging, thermoforming, and sustainable design. Can you tell us more about what your work has involved over the years, including your time at APR, of course, and why it gives you a unique perspective on the recycling data we're discussing today?
Yeah, for sure. I reflect on my career, and of course, it's revolved entirely around plastic packaging. But when I look deeper at every step of the way, it's involved recycled plastics to some extent. So whether that's using post-consumer materials, designing packaging to be recycled, or actually recycling itself. So I've always been part of that segment of the industry and a longtime APR member prior to joining the team here. Early on in my career, right out of school, I worked for a company that made plastic packaging through a thermoforming process primarily, and it was very focused on PET. We tried to use a lot of post-consumer content as much as we could in our formulations. We quickly found out that there was not enough high quality, readily available, and of course, priced PCR content out there. So we thought, hey, why not do it ourselves? What could go wrong? Found myself suddenly becoming a recycler. So here I was designing the system that would make our PET, our rPET, installing it, starting up, and then, of course, solving all the problems that go in the day-to-day operation of a recycling plant. Never a challenge that we've faced before that we couldn't tackle, but a really interesting opportunity. Once we handled the bulk of the recycling process, it was a very technically feasible operation. The next challenge, though, was convincing people to buy our packages made from it. So a bit of an uphill battle in incorporating that PCR content in a way that our customers and their consumers found to be acceptable. It was quite difficult early on, but eventually building products to highlight the recycled content was a key piece. And we saw a lot of uptake in brands that were willing to not just use the recycled content, but to build their own brand around it and use the recycled content as a selling point for their product, right? So when I look at data in the report, I have the ability to see the whole picture and understand the story that's behind it. You know, I live the reality of the system that's often not in sync with itself. When we had demand, there was no supply. When we had the supply, there was no demand for what we were making. And it's always been a bit of a push-pull in this industry. However, the last couple of years have become increasingly complicated with import pressures and stuff like that. I'm sure we'll talk about it today. It's hard not to talk about it in this conversation about the recycling rate and what's going on in North America.
You have all of the kind of experience that makes you perfect for us to bring you in at APR. We like to take people who used to be members and bring them into our staff. You've faced a lot of the challenges in your career that we face head on at APR every day and try to come up with solutions for those. Now, back to the study. The headline from the recycling study is that the U.S. recovered more than 5.1 billion pounds of post-consumer plastic in 2024. So that sounds like a major success, but when you read the results of this study alongside APR's other recent reports, it feels like the bigger story is more complicated. What do you think are some of the key takeaway from all three reports together?
Right. So first of all, there's some wins to discuss. So recycling volumes, top line volumes have increased. There's wins in the data, primarily with film and with non-bottle PET, where there's been considerable growth. We see that this indicates that the system is working, at least from a collection and processing standpoint. Of course, there's more work to do on the collection side. We know that. But plastic recycling is proving to be technically feasible, very capable industry that is large in volume, but these economic pressures restricting its growth. So that is really the biggest barrier today. We've seen an underutilization of the recycling capacity that's available, and that's driven by just this weak demand and lack of consistent demand of the materials that the recyclers produce. So it's my opinion that plastic recycling is not really complete until we take the materials that the recyclers produce and make something new out of it. So I do love that APR is focused on working on closing that part of the circular economy as well as the design side.
Exactly. We focus on what is coming into the system as well as what is coming out of the system. Like you said, we want to complete that circle and take that material that's being recycled and put it into new things, sometimes new bottles or whatever it came from, and sometimes other applications as well. Looking at the recycling study itself, overall recovery increased by about 115 million pounds from the previous reporting period, which was in 2022. We do these studies every 2 years, but the trends varied by material category. Plastic film grew significantly while bottle recovery declined. What stood out to you the most in this year's data?
Yeah, so let's start with the bad news. Bottle recovery is down, both in PET and HDPE. I think there's similar reasons behind that. The scale of the decline was a bit greater with HDPE. But on the PET side, I look at that decrease of 22 million pounds and I think, yeah, that's to be expected. I also know that in 2024, the production of PET bottles themselves declined. So, there's less supply to be collected. There's less, available to the reclaimers. They're producing less. It's not ideal. I mean, ideally, we would see that demand would be so strong for domestic rPET that it would require the system to reach out and capture some of that underutilized areas, undercaptured sources of material. But we're not seeing that. So either brands or end users of that rPET are deciding to not use recycled content, or they're seeking it from imported sources. The good news is that film is up to 107 million pounds. And I wonder why everyone is not talking about this. I mean, we've been talking about the need in flexible recycling for a long time. There's understandably a lot of ground to make up in that segment of plastics reclamation. But the growth we're seeing in plastics recycling overall is really being driven by the film in this report. And in our meetings, when we connect as a membership, the stories that are being told is it's just not the growth of composite lumber itself. It is actually film to film type applications that are also growing. So from our membership, there's clearly a hunger from the flexible packaging membership. They want that recycled feedstock, they want it to fit their needs. And there's like a lot of hunger for that. So I think we'll continue to see the growth coming from this segment, and that will probably be fueling the top line growth of plastics recycling overall.
Right. That is an interesting story. I think that's one that we hear a lot where people don't have confidence in film recycling and also don't have confidence in film to film recycling. But we are seeing that and we are seeing growth. Anything to add about that other plastics category? And what does that one mean?
Other plastics are things that are like not easily to characterize within bottle or flexible segments. This is an interesting one. It's up only 5 million pounds, but growth is growth. So perhaps we're finding more niche opportunities to recover plastics into niche applications. So I think there could be better data, more clear data on what this is and what those end markets are. I'm hoping that EPR can provide some of that information, those programs, because that's an interesting one. I mean, PET bottles, HDPE bottles tend to take up all the oxygen in the room when we talk about plastics recycling. But, growth in these like small segments is something that we should key into also.
Exactly. And we are seeing in this report, you just mentioned a lack of data. And that is something that we need more of. EPR can definitely bring that to the forefront. We can get a lot more information. One trend that doesn't seem to get as much attention is the continued decline in plastic exports for recycling. For years, there was a common misconception that most recyclable plastics were exported overseas. This study found that nearly 94% of recovered plastic stayed in North America, including Canada and Mexico, with 4.4 billion pounds processed by U.S. reclaimers alone. What does this tell us about the strength of our domestic recycling infrastructure, and why is that an important story to tell?
Yeah, it's a really important story. And this is a good question because I don't think the average consumer understands this with regards to plastic recycling.
Agreed.
So we're obviously successful in utilizing what I consider a domestic resource, these polymers that are harvested from our homes and from our curbsides that get remade every day into products that, help transport food. They protect our food and beverages. They make our lives better. And we do that to the tune of 5 billion pounds a year pretty quietly and largely within our borders. So I think it's a really positive success story that should be highlighted. I mean, the recycling industry generates a lot of jobs and economic activity across the board, but especially in those states where active plastic reclamation is happening.
Always good to hear the economic benefits of recycling mentioned, because I think something that people often forget is that it is a business. It requires supply and demand. It creates a lot of jobs and benefits to the area where these businesses operate. So yes, we are recycling right here in the United States and all across North America as well. As we've mentioned, you have largely focused on PET throughout your career. So let's talk about that. When many people think about plastic recycling, they picture a PET beverage bottle. They remain one of the largest and most important recycling streams and represent about 70% of the bottles recovered in 2024. What are your thoughts on the PET bottle data in this report specifically?
I think it highlights that PET is a high value stream and there's a lot of activity and processing of PET being done. So we in the US and Canada successfully recycles about 2 billion pounds a year. It's been doing that for a number of years. So it's a large volume of material. What that means is we're taking waste from the curbside and turning it into a package that is pretty highly demanding. This is a clear bottle that looks good on the shelf and holds water. Water is super sensitive to any sort of abnormalities or compounds that could affect its taste. It's an incredible success story, this bottle to bottle recycling of PET being done on such a large scale. The domestic processing capacity mentioned in the report is a bit tough to read because we know what happened after the surveying period of this report closed. Within just a few months, we lost about 7 production facilities, at least temporarily, and that equates to roughly 25% of the total rPET production capacity. So the decline that we see in this report, that 22 million pounds is a bit of foreshadowing of what was about to come, I think.
Right. Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that because I think that can be a little confusing for some people. Again, this data is from 2024. And then after that, we saw about 7 PET recycling plants close. Like you said, We did see that PET bottles were down. That was some foreshadowing, and what we expected to happen, unfortunately, did happen. APR has also been talking about significant economic pressure on recyclers for quite some time. And our report on record plastic production and imports puts a spotlight on the PET market specifically. From your perspective, what's the most important thing that people should understand about the pressure domestic PET recyclers are facing?
Yeah, so a number of things. It is highly pressured system at the moment. So domestic recyclers are competing right now in a very difficult market. The primary, if I was to give an overview and give you two main sources of pain, it's the pricing pressure and the oversupply of PET, primarily from imports. So first off, the pricing pressure is the key driver, especially with the closures that followed the closing of the surveying period. Price is a key driver, like it is in any manufacturing sector. For a long time, our PET use was a cost savings to the packaging manufacturer. It fluctuated a bit relative to virgin over the years, but typically it was less expensive to buy than a virgin PET. That changed probably for good in 2023. And since then, recycled content PET has been selling at a much higher price. Now we see this playing out in how it affects the end markets. So two of the key end markets that buy this rPET are textile, carpet fiber, your polyester fabrics, and then also non-bottle PET. Those two end markets are very price sensitive. They will move away from higher cost feedstocks if they can, and if their customers allow it. And generally, their customers aren't really in tune with the recycled content of those products. Beverage, on the other hand, is the biggest end market for rPET. Beverage bottles tend to be stickier in their use of PET, of rPET, and that's because they have more public commitments regarding the use of recycled content. And in some states, there are actually requirements for recycled content to be used in those packages. So beverage tends to be a bit stickier. The other end markets, they can move away from utilizing PCR if they need to because of this pricing pressure. That all creates some unstable demand for the recyclers. Now, the oversupply of PET is another pressure. It also impacts the pricing, of course. But primarily outside the U.S., we're seeing some key exporting countries exerting a lot of pressure on the North American market through overproduction, both of virgin, but also a large volume of recycled content. So this has driven not just the closure of recycled PET plants, but also the closure of virgin plants and reduction in capacity on the virgin side within North America. So that virgin capacity decline preceded the recycled capacity decline by about a year. It's not a fair playing field. These countries that export large volumes tend to be highly subsidized from the government in their production. And that allows them to operate at production costs that North American markets generally cannot compete with our higher labor costs, our higher energy costs, water costs, stuff like that. So not a fair playing field. It trickles through the whole system in a challenging way, with the recycler kind of at the end going, what do I do here?
Right. They face lots of challenges, but we still do have some positive messaging in there. One key message we see across these reports: recycling works. Despite all these challenges, again, we still managed to recycle 5.1 billion pounds in 2024. Recycling isn't limited by capability, it's limited by market conditions, as you just talked about. Today, low-cost virgin plastic often has the advantage, making stronger demand for recycled materials and policies to improve recycling essential to growing the industry. APR also released the report, How to Rebuild and Protect North America's Recycling System, that clearly outlines these types of solutions. And you briefly touched on them just a moment ago, but let's dig into those a little bit deeper. If you had to highlight the most important priorities from that report, what would they be?
So, of course, I work at APR. I'm going to talk about package design.
Right.
This is the first and most important step in circularity. If this isn't right, almost nothing else matters down the chain. If something's not designed to be recycled, it's not going to get recycled. So packaging design that is more compatible with recycling systems will always lead to better recycling outcomes. That's first and foremost. Collection and better sorting, of course. there's a lot of untouched areas in this country. Texas is one to watch. I am very interested in whether they will consider a deposit return scheme program again in their upcoming legislative session. They're a huge market. There's a huge volume of materials in Texas that are untapped. And we know how effective DRS can be at bringing in high quality feedstocks. So if we were to get that kind of volume into the system, it could really change the game for sure. And then investment in infrastructure. This one is important, but maybe not top of mind for me at this moment because I've lived the reality of if we build it, they will come, not really working out. That strategy just kind of hasn't worked for plastics recycling. Demand pull works. If demand becomes more consistent, the value of the PCR stabilizes. And that's something we can plan on. It's a lot easier to build a business case, to add a material recovery facility, to build a recycling plant, to upgrade your systems if you know what the future is going to look like. And if you have the sense of, oh, this is the kind of return I will get on my investments. But being a technical person, I always like to highlight that it's not just a technical problem, but policy can also play a key role in improving what's happening. So I think policy is one of the most important measures for securing the demand side of the equation. Using recycled content cannot be purely optional. People don't do it just for fun and just to feel good anymore. We're too sensitive to pricing. So we need an instrument to create this consistent pull through the system. Ideally, whatever measures, EPR, programs like that would also incentivize the use of domestically sourced recycled materials as much as they can. And then with policy, you have the opportunity to not just fix the end of the cycle, but the beginning, the design side. I just said that design is super important. It's also great if these policy measures can highlight, incentivize, require proper design for the packaging from the start.
Policy and the technical work that we do at APR, they go hand in hand. And much of your work, as you said, with APR's PET Technical Committee focuses on the APR Design Guide for Plastic Recyclability. Obviously, we talk about this all the time on the podcast. It's the core of what we do at APR, but designing plastic packaging for recyclability has never been more important, as voluntary commitments are replaced by mandatory requirements. You've touched on this, but let's dig into that a little bit more. How much does package design influence whether material can successfully move through the recycling system? And what are some of the key things to look out for in the design phase?
Yeah, so design of the package is super impactful, the most important piece of the puzzle. And depending on the package that you're utilizing, the design features that are good or detrimental to the recycling system are going to vary. So I would always highlight the design guide as the best reference for that, of course. But, some designs of packaging are not recyclable at all. And at best, they end up in a landfill completely unrecovered. But often they do damage along the way. So they end up in the recycler systems and either impact their outputs, impact their equipment, impact their processing capabilities. So it's important to remember just how important design is, because recycling itself is just a matter of removing contamination from the target material. So in my case, the target material was PET. I was trying to remove everything from the system that was not PET. So that's labels, that's inks, that's caps, what have you. The equipment we use and the systems that recyclers have are wildly capable of doing that. It's really interesting to see if you have a chance to go to a recycler that's processing curbside materials and you watch what goes into their line, and then you see the shiny flakes that are super clean come up the other end. It seems like magic. It's not magic. I've lived it, but it's not magic. But these systems are deliberately designed to deal with contamination. So from an APR standpoint, we're trying to highlight what those contaminants are and how they can be either more compatible with the recycling system, or maybe they're not compatible at all and we should encourage people to not use them. Our technical committees at APR identify and address these deliberately. So we develop our design guide to highlight what's good, what's bad, and what's impossible to recycle. There's a lot of pressures. I've already talked about it from an economic standpoint on the recyclers. What we can do within our APR community, within our technical committees, is work to improve the quality of the materials that enter those recycler systems and allow them to create products that are high value at the end where they can easily find an end market for them.
It's really a fascinating process to see how all of these things can affect the recyclability of plastics and other materials. You mentioned going into a facility and seeing it for yourself. We always encourage people to do that. The last couple of years, we've launched a Recycling in Action Month where we invite people to come to material recovery facilities and the recyclers to see the process in action. That was in May, but you can do that at any time. So we encourage people to check out your local MRF, check out your local recyclers, and see this in action. All of these things affect recyclability. And when you can see the process from sortation to going through the whole system and then on to the recycler, it's really interesting to see. Finally, to wrap up today, if we have this conversation again, because as I mentioned, we do this study every 2 years. So we just got our 2024 numbers, and the next study will cover this year, 2026. If we have this conversation again when that plastic recycling study is released, what would success look like to you? What signs would tell you that the recycling system is not only recovering more material, but becoming stronger and more resilient?
Yeah, so within the lens of this report and reports of this nature, I'm always wanting to see that top line growth. That increase in volume is always good to see. Ideally, evenly distributed across the different formats. I think film will continue to kind of outpace the other segments in their growth for quite a while, but I would like to see growth across the board. I'd also, maybe not addressed in this report directly, but this is data that I also look at is the leveling off of import volumes. We're sort of seeing that right now in PT, but it's hard to tell if tariffs or conflict in the Middle East are playing a role in what role they're playing. So I would like to see the leveling off or even decline of imported materials. That will also help stabilize the domestic recycling industry. I would like to see PCR prices become more stable, particularly in HDPE. There's a bit of volatility there. PET is a bit more stable, but as those become more predictable into the future, you'll see people becoming more confident in investing in recycling and building out the systems and upgrading their current systems. And that will lead to a healthier industry overall for the long run. And then last but not least, the metric that I look to more than anything is the bale price. So bale price is what recyclers are paying to bring materials into their plants for processing. And that price stability is super critical for them because it starts out their journey in making PCR and the amount of those materials available. It would be wonderful to see those grow at a steady pace while also seeing exports decline. So all three of those things, if we have stable bales price, we have stable growing collection and declining exports would, to me, indicate a very strong and healthy industry.
Well, that sounds like a great story. Let's hope we're talking about all of these things happening when we're back talking about the 2026 study. So thanks so much for joining us today, Megan. I think you brought a lot of clarity to the 2024 data as well as our other reports. So it's been great having you today.
Yeah, it's been great chatting with you, Kara. Thanks for having me.
And thanks to everyone for listening. For more information about APR, the 2024 U.S. Post-Consumer Plastic Recycling Study, and the reports we discussed today, visit plasticsrecycling.org. You can find direct links to all three in the informational resources. For more information about APR, plastic recycling, and much more, visit the APR website at plasticrecycling.org. Check us out on LinkedIn, Facebook, and X at APR Recycles. You can find recycled content wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to like, subscribe, rate, and review.
This podcast was recorded in the studios of
Policy Resolution Group, Washington, D.C.